Well, hello xenographers everywhere, and welcome to another episode. The ability to create beautiful background blur is an important part of the image to many photographers, myself included, and ideally that blur needs to be pleasing, characterful and a little bit special as well. Today we're going to look at 4 lenses plus one rather special adapter that will give your images unique and characterful blur in abundance. So without further ado, let's introduce the first of those blur producing beauties, and that's the Carl Zeiss Jena 35mm f2.4 Flectagon. This is one of my favourite lenses, BarNone, and you might find this a surprising choice as a blur producer, as it's a 35mm. But this isn't just any 35mm lens. Now in day-to-day photography, street photography for example, it behaves like most other 35mm, and at longer subject to camera distances, it won't give you that much blur at all. But this lens has a trick, in fact 2 tricks up its sleeve, that many other 35s, certainly vintage 35s, don't. And those are its maximum aperture of f2.4 and its minimum focus distance of 20 centimeters. As well as being a great street lens, this is my go-to lens for product photography. I've used it extensively in that area. It makes beautiful images with some very, very soft blur. In fact, it has some of the nicest, softest blur I've seen. This lens makes products look wonderful. It makes them look dreamy. It makes them look desirable. It's also great for close video work. And in fact, most of the videos on this channel have been made with this lens. The blur it produces is some of the sweetest and nicest I've seen from any lens. It's soft, it's dreamy, it's buttery, and there's just no unsweet spot where the blur becomes busy or harsh. You can rely on this lens to give sweet, soft blur throughout. There's no doubt about it, in the blur department, this lens is nothing short of magical. It's a great lens for general close to moderately close photography. While not a macro lens, nevertheless, it allows you to explore the world of the small, and I've found it adds an extra dimension to photography, opening up fresh avenues of inspiration. Suddenly, you're in a whole new arena, and it takes you into a world where most other lenses can't go. With this lens, you can think in terms of details and small features, and the familiar and mundane become fresh and fascinating. It's so good that if I could keep only one lens, this would probably be it. It really is that good. Over the past few years, it's achieved a well-deserved cult status, so prices have risen and it's not the cheapest lens out there. But at £130 to £180, it's not the most expensive either. If you get the chance, try one. I guarantee you won't be disappointed. Next up, we have the Camlan 50mm 1.1, a lens that's in production today. It's not a vintage lens, but it does have a vintage flavour in that it's entirely manual, with no electronic functions at all. This lens is a true bokeh monster, and it'll give you an abundance of the blurry stuff, separating the subject from the background up to a distance of 4 or 5 meters or so, usually a feature of longer lenses. Because of this, I've found it very useful for street portraits. It gives images a bit of 3D pop and stops them looking flat. Depth of field is razor thin though, so focusing needs to be accurate. But it's at closer subject distances where this lens gives its maximum blur, and at close range that blur becomes truly epic. Deep blur is very smooth indeed, dreamy, creamy and soft. Point light sources become enormous bubbles, circular in the central area, becoming only slightly elliptical towards the edges. At closer background distances, there's a slightly unsweet spot where blur can become a little busy and slightly harsh, but you won't encounter it often. Most of the time, this lens is sweet. f1.1 makes it great for night photography too, and lights at night give you bubbles by the bucketful. It's specifically made for mirrorless and is available in both E-mount and Micro Four Thirds, and it costs around £120 to £140. For an f1.1 lens, I'd say that's pretty good value. A really nice lens for your mirrorless camera in the vintage tradition. Next up is the Zuiko 50mm f1.4, another of my favourite lenses, and it'll give your images a positively indecent amount of blur. This lens has some of the softest blur I've seen. It's absolutely lovely. While there are slight differences between versions, earlier silver nose versions being very slightly nicer than later black nosed ones, there really isn't much in it, and all of them will give you some very nice blur indeed. This lens has something of a magical quality. Deep background blur is always soft and delicious, and it never seems to become harsh or busy or unpleasant. Shapes and colours just merge into each other, creating a beautiful wash of light and form. Point light sources are circular in the central area, becoming slightly elliptical towards the edges, giving you an abundance of beautiful bubbles. And there's no noticeable unsweet or harsh spot from this lens. It's wonderful right across the range. So blur from closer backgrounds is always lovely too. It makes a great portrait lens as well, and if, like me, you enjoy making street portraits, it separates the subject from the background even when you're not particularly close, giving images plenty of 3D pop. A great little lens, one that I've used a great deal and will continue to use, and around £70 to £90 for a good one, a great value lens too. Next up, we have a real blur monster, the Zuiko 200mm f4. And if it's the blurry stuff you're after, there are not too many lenses that will give you more than this one. It'll give you lovely creamy blur in almost any situation, and it keeps on giving even when the subject is a fair distance away. I've used this lens quite a bit for street portraits and street photography in general, and this is an area where it really excels because it separates the subject and the background with plenty of 3D pop. Minimum focus distance is 2.5 meters, but that doesn't matter because it has such a long reach. Deep background blur is soft, creamy and smooth, and that's also true when backgrounds are nearer. If there is a harsh and unsweet spot to this lens, I've yet to find it. Point light sources produce bubbles in abundance, and they're always pleasing, always beautiful. This is one of the nicest blur producing lenses I know, and at around £30 to £40 for a good example, it's probably one of the cheapest too. At this price, you really can't go wrong. Finally, we've got a piece of kit that will give you some really unique blur and will allow you to make some very unusual images. It's not a lens, it's an adapter, more specifically a tilt adapter. You've probably heard of a tilt-shift lens. This adapter has the tilt function only, which means that it allows the lens to tilt left, right, up and down, and move the plane of focus relative to the sensor. What that means in practical terms is that far and distant objects can be in focus at the same time, with a wash of blur which doesn't depend on distance for its positioning. The results can be very pleasing indeed and very unusual, although I do think the effect should be used sparingly because it just isn't appropriate for every image. Experiment and play around with it though, and you'll get some real stunners. I'm not quite sure why, but this effect can give objects the appearance of models and toys. If anybody knows why, please do leave a comment and let me know. Whatever the reason, it's a very cool effect indeed. The tilt effect can be simulated with software, but that only works with images that have large depth of field, such as you might get from a phone camera. Software can't change existing blur within an image, and anyway, I think it's always better to shoot rather than simulate. I've had loads of fun with this adapter, and at 20 quid it certainly won't break the bank. Buy one, try one. I think you'll enjoy it. So there we are. 4 great little lenses and 1 great little adapter, all of which will give you some beautiful signature blur with plenty of character. So that's it from me for now. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you go, and I'll see you next time for some more Zenography. As ever, thanks for watching.